Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, anyways, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about my final fight breakdown and my final fight prediction for this Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant fight, which I think is a very interesting fight. I'm going to talk about in this video who I think is going to win the fight and why. What are Caleb Plant's chances of defeating Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion? If Canelo Alvarez does win this fight, who do I think he should face next, and who do I think he is going to face next? We'll talk about that. And on top of that, we'll also talk about how I believe that Canelo Alvarez, once again, is the number one pound for pound fighter in the whole entire world. Anyways, just getting into it. If we're talking about the fight prediction for this fight tomorrow, and I'm very, very personally excited for it, this is a very big fight. It means a lot. And the reason why that is because not only is Caleb Plant, in my opinion, a very talented young fighter, and not only do I believe that he is an A-grade fighter, but whoever wins this fight is going to have every single one of the belts, I believe, at the super middleweight division, at the 168-pound division. And Canelo Alvarez, I believe that if he accomplishes that tomorrow, he's going to be the first Latino or Hispanic fighter in history, all in all, to accomplish that in any division, especially at 168 pounds, because I don't think that anyone has unified all the belts at 168 pounds before. Now, if I'm wrong about that, if I'm wrong about Canelo Alvarez being the first Latino fighter to completely unify every single belt in the division, or at least all four, when it comes down to it, then someone correct me. But I do believe, all in all, that I am correct about that. At least that's the information that I've been hearing about. But, we'll see what happens. Anyways, when it comes down to it, all in all, who do I personally believe is going to win this fight tomorrow? I do have to go with Canelo Alvarez. I think that Caleb Plant, I think that he's a very talented fighter. I think that Caleb Plant, he's a decent athlete. He's very fast. He's very speedy. He's got great hand speed. I think that he's got great foot speed, great feet. He seems to be on the balls of his feet the majority of the time, which is usually what you want to do when you're boxing. You don't want to be flat-footed. You don't want to have slow feet. Which, like I said, if there's only one criticism that I've ever had of Canelo Alvarez, or that I would still have about him now, I guess I would say, maybe he could work on his feet just a little bit more. But I would not necessarily say that his feet are bad necessarily. I would just say, all in all, that maybe at times he could work on being on the balls of his feet a little bit more, because sometimes when I do see him throw punches, sometimes he does tend to be a little bit flat-footed. But all in all, that doesn't mean that Canelo Alvarez has the worst feet that I've ever seen. It is what it is. Anyways, moving on when it comes down to it, Canelo Alvarez, besides that one little criticism, he pretty much is the perfect fighter. And not only with his skill set, but with his accomplishments and his resume, I believe that there is no doubt in the world, at least in my opinion, there's no doubt whatsoever that Canelo Alvarez is the clear number one pound for pound boxer in the whole entire world. I don't see another candidate right now. Now, of course, there's some people that would debate that. There's some people that would say, well, what about Terrence Crawford or Tyson Fury or Alexander Usyk or Errol Spence Jr.? I could see debates for every single one of those guys, but when you talk about, like I said, I rank off of four categories. I rank off of resume, accomplishments, dominance, and skill set. When you talk about every single one of those categories, Canelo is the only fighter on the planet, at least in terms of boxing right now, in my opinion, that can have an A-plus grade in every single one of those categories. When you talk about resume, clearly is A+. When you talk about accomplishments, clearly is A+. When you talk about skill set, clearly is A+. And even when you talk about dominance, in my opinion, you would have to say at least an A or an A+. Some may not put an A+ just because, he had a little bit of problems against Billy Joe Saunders, and on top of that, he has a couple of controversial decisions in his career. Some would debate. But when it comes down to it, usually the controversial decisions, they came against fighters that were extremely talented, like either a Gennady Golovkin or an Araceli Lara. So I'll give Canelo Alvarez at least a little bit of a break. And on top of that, Canelo Alvarez, on top of that, he beat Gennady Golovkin, in my opinion, in the rematch. And Araceli Lara, even though I think that you certainly could debate maybe that Lara won the fight, and it was a split decision for a reason, Araceli Lara, you can maybe say in certain spots, should have done more or should have threw more. So I certainly understand why some people maybe think that Canelo Alvarez pulled that fight off. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. And of course, he has that one loss to Floyd Mayweather Jr., but I mean, Floyd Mayweather Jr., and I've said this in my opinion, he's debatably the greatest fighter that I've personally ever seen in the history of all of boxing. So it is what it is. So I cut Canelo Alvarez some slack there. But it is what it is. But Canelo, when you talk about his career, in my opinion, he really is becoming an all-time great before our very eyes. I think that Canelo Alvarez, if he continues to go on this trend, if he continues to win the big fights of his career, which I think is very, very possible, we have to probably talk about him at least being within the top 20 boxers of all time, at least within my opinion. It depends on how his career goes. But a win over Caleb Plant, in my opinion, is a very, very big win. Once again, Caleb Plant, this win would pretty much be on the same level as, like I said, a Billy Joe Saunders, a Jamal Charlo, a Demetrius Andrade, David Benavidez. Like I said, this is my opinion. All those guys are pretty much on the same level. It is what it is. I think that you can argue that certain guys are more talented than others when you talk about all those guys, but they're pretty much all in the same roundup. They're pretty much all in that same category. Very talented fighters, but I can all point out at least a few flaws about every single one of them. Caleb Plant, I think, is a very talented fighter. I think that he's very slick. I think he's very swift. I think that he has very good footwork. I think he has very good head movement, and he's a very decently slick fighter. I think that he's going to fight Canelo Alvarez tomorrow, and I think that he mainly is going to try to outbox him. But I do think that he is going to take heed of Andre Ward's advice, and, I think that's a very good person to train with. I think that's a very good person to go to advice for, because Andre Ward, he knows what it takes to win the biggest fights of his career. And he was in a decently talented division as well. Andre Ward was one of the best slick fighters of this generation, no doubt about it. Andre Ward was a great fighter. He was an all-time great fighter. There's no doubt about it. So when it comes down to it, like I said, Andre Ward, training with him, I think is a very good idea. Unfortunately, I just don't think that Caleb Plant is an Andre Ward. Caleb Plant, in my opinion, isn't a great fighter. But Caleb Plant, like I said, there's a difference between a Caleb Plant and Andrade and a Charlo and a Saunders and a Benavidez and someone like an Andre Ward. Caleb Plant, in my opinion, is a very talented fighter, but I do have to go with Canelo Alvarez in this fight. Caleb Plant, I do think that there's a possibility that he can give Canelo Alvarez some problems. Canelo may even have some more problems in this fight than what he did against Billy Joe Saunders. But I'm not sure if I can pick Caleb Plant to win this fight. In fact, I would give him about maybe at most a 30% chance. And I've always kind of stuck with that. Caleb Plant, once again, is a very talented fighter. But there's one flaw that I see with him. All in all, he just does not keep his hands up as much as he needs to. He kind of reminds me a little bit of a fighter that some of you may be familiar with, William Joppy. I always heard from a certain amount of people that William Joppy was this great fighter back in the day. He was a decent contender, but I never really thought all in all that he was this all-time great fighter. William Joppy was a decent athlete back in the day. He was a fighter that was a decent contender, but anytime he would usually fight an A-class fighter, he pretty much would lose. Like when he fought Felix Tito Trinidad. Felix Tito Trinidad was basically able to whoop his ass because even though William Joppy, even though he had some slickster abilities to him, he would never keep his hands up. So every time Felix Tito Trinidad would throw a left hook down the pipe, William Joppy basically was not able to avoid it. Now, Caleb Plant, in my opinion, he's probably going to be more defensively irresponsible than once upon a time what William Joppy was. But we're going to see overall to what extent. That is one thing that Caleb Plant does have to worry about. You have to worry about Canelo Alvarez's power and his counter-punching ability constantly. He is a great fighter. He has great counter-punching ability. He has great offense. He has great defense. He can fight coming forward. He can even fight going backward to a certain degree as well. When it comes down to it, so Canelo Alvarez, this man is no joke when it comes down to it. Caleb Plant, like I said, I think that his strategy is mainly going to be trying to outbox Canelo Alvarez. I think that he's going to have some success in certain rounds. I think it's even very possible that he wins a few rounds out of this fight. Maybe he even wins as much as 4 rounds in this fight. Maybe even 5. But I'm not even sure if I'm going to go that far. I think that Caleb Plant, at most, maybe he wins 4 rounds in this fight. I think all in all that maybe he makes it a little bit competitive in the beginning. But all in all, Canelo Alvarez, he makes the best of adjustments when it comes down to it. And I think that Canelo, I do think that eventually he more than likely is probably going to stop him. I would say at about round 9 or 10. I don't know if he's going to, knock him out with one punch, kind of like he did with Billy Joe Saunders, where the fight had to be stopped because of a broken orbital eye bone. But I think that it is very possible that Canelo could break him down. And of course, if I see a unanimous decision, I would not be surprised as well. or I would not be surprised either. I think that, once again, Caleb Plant, he's very maneuverable, he's very slick, he's very tricky, he's very speedy, so we'll see what happens. If Caleb Plant were to pull off the upset, would it be the biggest upset that I've ever seen? No, but it would be a decent upset because I assure you, Canelo Alvarez is at least a 10-1 favorite over any of the guys at 160 or 168 right now. At least in my opinion, he is. Some people would disagree. But like I said, when you talk about Caleb Plant, Jamal Charlo, Demetrius Andrade, David Benavidez, Billy Joe Saunders, a lot of these guys, they're pretty much all on the same level when it comes down to it, at least in my opinion. I think they're all very talented, but they do have flaws, at least more flaws than what a Canelo Alvarez does. Now, in my opinion, after Canelo Alvarez probably wins this fight against Caleb Plant, who do I think that he's going to face next? Who do I think he should face next? Well, there's a multitude of opponents you could face. You could face Dimitri Bivol. You could face Artur Beterbiev. Maybe even Gvozdyk if you wanted to move up to 175 and face him. Even though he does not necessarily have a belt, that would still be a decent fight when it comes down to it. If you want to try and test your will at the 175-pound division a little bit more. You could face Jamal Charlo. You could face David Benavidez, Demetrius Andrade, any one of those fighters. But out of all the fighters, in my opinion, that is more than likely to happen, I believe that Canelo Alvarez, I think that he sounds interested in a Jamal Charlo fight. I think that he's interested in that fight. He's been talking about Jamal Charlo for the past year, and I think that he is interested in that Jamal Charlo fight. And I think that he believes that it's time for Jamal Charlo's shot. I think he believes that that would be a very decently big fight. And I think that that's a fight overall that really highly interests him. In my opinion, and this is my opinion because a lot of people, of course, they try to tear Caleb Plant down. They basically say, well, if Caleb Plant, if he fought Jamal Charlo or David Benavidez or any of these other fighters, he wouldn't be the favorite against them. I disagree. I think that Caleb Plant, I think that he, in my opinion, I think that he would beat Jamal Charlo. But once again, I think Jamal Charlo is a very decent fighter. But I think that Jamal Charlo, I think that he pretty much is the Danny Garcia of the upper weight classes. Meaning what? I think he's very talented. I think all in all that he's an A-grade fighter. But he's a person that, in my opinion, if he actually were to face a certain amount of these other A-grade boxers, like a Billy Joe Saunders at his best, or a Caleb Plant, or a Demetrius Andrade, or a David Benavidez, I'm not sure if he'd beat any of those guys, in my opinion. Jamal Charlo, actually, in my opinion, out of all those guys, is the weakest link. Not Billy Joe Saunders, not Caleb Plant. In my opinion, it's Jamal Charlo, because he just is not slick enough. He does not have a great head movement. He does not have a great defensive, responsibility. He has great power, when it comes down to it. And all in all, he has a decent foundation of skills. But he's not a person, all in all, in my opinion, that would win a lot of those A-grade fights. At least when you talk about the real deal opponents, the Andrades, the Plants, the Benavidez, the Saunders, those guys. You know what I mean? So it is what it is. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Of course, I've been wrong before. Everyone has been. But when it comes down to it, Jamal Charlo, in my opinion, is probably the easiest fight for Canelo Alvarez out there. But a lot of people want that fight. It would pay a lot of money. I think Canelo Alvarez is very interested in that fight next. I believe that is the fight that is probably going to happen next. So we'll see all in all what happens with that. I've heard rumors of a Gennady Golovkin trilogy, but I do not hope that fight happens because Gennady Golovkin at this point in time in his career, I don't see how he has a chance against Canelo. I think that a few years ago, when he had those two matches against Canelo, it pretty much was 50-50. But at this point, I would not even give Gennady Golovkin a 30% chance. Golovkin is just, in the last big fight that I seen him in against Sergey Derevyanchenko, he basically looked like a shell of himself. He didn't look like he had anywhere near the same amount of punch resistance. And on top of that, he just gets hit way easier now. Not like he ever had A-grade head movement before. But when it comes down to it all in all, he's just a little bit too vulnerable, in my opinion, at this point in time in his career. So I'm hoping that we get to see a Jamal Charlo fight. I would be very interested in that fight. Then maybe after that, we'll have to see. An Artur Beterbiev fight I think would be very interesting. David Benavidez, Demetrius Andrade, of course, they're on the table. All those fights would be very, very interesting. A fight that actually I wish would really, really happen if Andre Ward decides to. I really hope that Andre Ward maybe possibly comes out of retirement and maybe faces Canelo Alvarez in a big super fight because that would be a mega fight. That would be a fight worth possibly 1 million pay-per-view buys because in my opinion, if there is a fighter all in all from this generation that is going to beat Canelo, more than likely, it maybe would have been an Andre Ward. Just because he has that slick style, he would have at least somewhat of enough power to keep Canelo Alvarez off of him. And on top of that, he's just a very, very decent fighter. And on top of that, he can compete with Canelo in terms of size. He would be a little bit bigger than Canelo, actually. So that would be a very interesting fight. I would have loved to have seen that fight. But it would be very, very interesting. Anyways, we'll see what happens. I actually do hope that that's what happens. I hope Andre Ward comes out of retirement, and I hope him and Canelo, I hope that they have a super fight, because that would be very, very interesting. But anyways, that's pretty much it for today. I believe that Canelo Alvarez more than likely probably is going to get the stoppage at around 9-10. I think that it's very possible that we may see a unanimous decision as well. I'm going to say that Caleb Plant pulls out 3 to 4 rounds, but it'll be very, very interesting. We'll see all in all what happens. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. Let me know overall what you guys think, and I'll talk to you all later.